Hello, my name is Jason Demora, and welcome back to By Faith Bible Studies. 2 weeks ago, we ended our study in 1 Kings 1 through 11, looking at the life of Solomon, and last week we began our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. We looked at verses 1 through 11, which serve as a sort of introductory poem to the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes written by Solomon to the people of Israel, he being the preacher, he being the son of the David, king in Jerusalem. And these first 11 verses begin with the thesis, the main point of Ecclesiastes, which is this: vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And so we looked at what vanity means, and we came to a understanding that vanity does not mean meaninglessness. And how important that is, because vanity, if it meant meaninglessness, then I shouldn't be even giving this sermon right now, because there's no point to even do so. Rather, vanity means breath, this idea that life is short and you cannot totally control it. But we glimpse forward, looking forward, even though Solomon does not talk about it in the first 11 passages. I didn't want to leave us on a dark note, and we looked forward to how in God, not ourselves, there is meaning. Because outside of the repetitive cycle of life, we can find meaning in Him, and we can find glory in Him by glorifying Him and living for Him, one who is outside of time. So it's important to dwell on this fact that vanity is breath, because we are going to be encountering vanity all throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Let me reiterate, vanity does not mean meaninglessness. Rather, it means that life is short. However, even the shortest vapor has meaning in the eyes of God. So now we begin 1 Ecclesiastes, and we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes 1, verses 12 through chapter 2, verse 26, the end of chapter 2. And what this begins is a sort of second introduction. And it is an introduction not only to the book of Ecclesiastes, but to Solomon. We are going to meet Solomon in these verses. And as we read it, I hope that you will see a reflection on what we looked at the past week, and you will see that it's very, very similar. However, it's spoken of from a personal light. And instead of writing to the people of Israel as the first 11 verses are, he is sort of talking to himself, studying himself, discussing who he is and how he feels about his own life. And Solomon is the one doing this. It's a second, more personal introduction. What's also interesting is that, yes, I alluded to God last week, but God is mentioned in these verses, and his hope in Him is first mentioned here. Solomon does not leave us in the dark for very long, but rather dwells on the hardships of life, but quickly jumps to God and shows that God is real, and there is hope, and there is meaning in Him. So let us read 1 Ecclesiastes 12 through chapter 2, 26. Ecclesiastes 12. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has observed wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after wind. Because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure, so enjoy yourself. And behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate with my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted them in all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself, from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had home-born slaves. Also I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Also I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasures of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hand had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. So I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king, except what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor, for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor, for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor, for which I labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and a great evil. For what does a man gain in all his labor and his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. There is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that labor is good. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? For to a person who is good in his sight he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after wind. This is the word of the living God. Let me pray. Dear Lord, as we address this text, give us wisdom, Lord. Give us wisdom to understand your holy words, Lord. Thank you for giving us a glimpse at the realities of life, a stark understanding of the hardships of reality, but also showing us how fleeting they are. But you are a God who is not fleeting, who lasts forever. Help us to dwell on you, live for you, and learn more of you, and enjoy the good things that you have given us. Amen. Like the text we looked at last week, this is a hard text to read, and it is a hard text to study. And I hope that as you looked at it closely, you will see, though, that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that there is hope, and that there is reason for living, and we know that there is reason for living. But we still do dwell in this hard text, this harsh reality of life, and the vanity of living in a cyclical world, in a fallen world. But it is important to not shy away from this text and to not shy away from Ecclesiastes, but to read it, to understand it, to dwell on it, and come out of it with a smile, because we will live for a God who lives outside of time. As we look at this text, we first see in chapter 1, verses 12 through 15, a personal introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes, a personal introduction. And we meet Solomon. I'm going to read these verses again. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done in the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. In the first half of the text, we see an establishment of credibility. It talks about who he is, how he is king over Israel and Jerusalem, how he has wisdom, and how he has done many great things, and he has much wisdom. And if we look at 1 Kings 1 through 4 and how it speaks about the beginning of Solomon's rule, how as he rose as a king, he had much wealth, much land, and we even spoke about how maybe he could have fulfilled the Abrahamic covenant, although I do not believe he did. And we saw how great Solomon was. But then we looked at 1 Kings 9 through 11 and we saw even greater wealth, even greater political power. And we saw that Solomon has incomparable wisdom, political prowess, economic stability, military might, and a plethora of pleasure. We saw all of this in Kings. And honestly, Solomon doesn't give us a lot in Ecclesiastes because it's not important to look at Solomon's greatness. It is rather to look at the vanity of Solomon's life. But because we've read Ecclesiastes, we know how great Solomon was. And because we know how great Solomon was, we know we can trust him to write the book of Ecclesiastes. He is credible to speak about the vanity of life because he has had it all. He has had more women than you can imagine. He has had more gold than you can count. He has had a land that has been magnificent and greater than any in Israel history. This man had it all, and by that he is credible. And as we read about how great Solomon was, and we read here him speaking about it, we would expect him to smile and have joy and be proud in all that he has done and in all the wisdom that he has, but he doesn't do that. And I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. Amazing. He has it all. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. Here we see a dark view on 1 Kings 1 through 11, a dark view on Solomon's life. It is not written from someone else, but it is written from Solomon himself, speaking about his own life. He looks at everything that he has. He looks at all the gold he had, all the women he had, all the chariots he had, the political power, the economic power, and he is unhappy. And he is unfulfilled. And he has a frown on his face. It doesn't seem to make sense that Solomon would have a frown on his face, yet he does. And it's important to understand that when he says that he is unhappy, its context is very important. He's not necessarily unhappy with life at its fullness, because I do believe that when he wrote Ecclesiastes, he was saved and must have had that joy that only God can give. But rather, he was unhappy and unfulfilled with all that he had done under the sun. And this idea that he looked at all that he had did on an earthly basis, and it was unfulfilling and unhappy. Solomon was unhappy in all that he had, all the gold, all the land, all the women, all the chariots, all of the political power was not enough. It made him unhappy. So here we see that Solomon is credible and Solomon is sad. And so he is the perfect candidate to write the book of Ecclesiastes, one who had it all, one who had more wisdom than you could possibly imagine. Yet he looks at all of it and he says, it is bad. It is a grievous task. It is vanity. It is striving after wind, this idea of trying to control life, yet it gets away from you. And he says here, what is lacking cannot be counted, what is crooked cannot be straightened. We live in a fallen world, and no matter how much you have, it cannot be fixed. It is a harsh introduction to himself. Also here we first meet God. And what's very interesting about the word God here is that as we look through 1 Kings 1 through 11, it always would say Lord, capital Lord. And I'm reading the NASB version, and so that's what it would say. However, when I read it, I always translate it to Yahweh, the rightful true name of God, of our God. Yahweh comes from the Hebrew word that speaks of I am who I am, spoken of in Exodus. It is the name of God, the God of Israel. However, here in Ecclesiastes, even though Solomon is recorded saying Yahweh in 1 Kings 1 through 11, here he never uses the name of God. Rather, he uses the word Elohim. And I think there are two reasons that he uses the word Elohim. The first is so that Ecclesiastes can be a more common book, a more general book, because Elohim is the common name for God. And so the Ecclesiastes can be written to all people, because Ecclesiastes and the topics that it speaks of are a feeling that we all feel at times, Jew or Gentile, believer or unbeliever. Everyone feels this feeling of meaninglessness, even though it is not meaninglessness. The second reason that I think he uses this word is because he is at such a low point that he feels he cannot even say the name of Yahweh. Because he has sinned against God, he has done evil, he has seen the meaninglessness of life, and he is broken in a sense. And so he uses the name Elohim. Yet I still do believe Solomon worships Yahweh and lives for Yahweh. But this book is not about Israel. It is not about the chosen people. It is about all people. And that God can be a God to all people in the hardships of life. Yet at the same time, it is this God who has created the world, who is God over a fallen world, who is the one who created monotony and said that you cannot find purpose or meaning in this earth. He is that God. And it's hard to think of him as that God, and that's why it's Elohim. Because it's hard for Solomon to imagine, yet it is true, that he is the one, the God over this world. Elohim. As we move forward in this text, we are going to see vanity depicted. Vanity depicted. We looked at vanity and the vanities of life last week, mostly speaking about death and how all will die and all will not be remembered. But here, Solomon gives two very clear examples of living life. He puts two different ways of living life on the scales and measures both of them. The first of them being wisdom and the second being folly. And it's very important to understand that as we look at this, I'm not saying that enjoying life is bad, and I'm not saying that being smart is bad. Rather, fully investing in these things is bad, and no matter if it's good or bad, it is vanity. It is vanity. Verses 16 through 18 of chapter 1 speak about wisdom. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after wind. Because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. Solomon had so much wisdom, and I do believe that he was the wisest man to ever live, besides Jesus, of course, but he's in another category. He had more wisdom than all who would come before him, more wisdom than anyone who would come after him. He had it all. Not just wisdom, godly wisdom, we spoke about this last week, but also knowledge, earthly knowledge, understanding of the times, of technology, of how to run a government, of how politics works, how economics works. He knew so much. A wealth of wisdom and knowledge. Yet he says of all of it, it was striving after wind. And what this teaches us is that wisdom, or on another terms, education, does not give you much. I think this is such a powerful text for me to look at now as I go off to college. And this understanding that I'm going to go and be educated and go to a prestigious college and learn. Yet it's important as I do that to understand that it doesn't going to give me very much in the sight of God. Education does not give you control over your own life. It does not give you the capability to change the world. No matter how many times a college says, if you come here, you can change the world, where they're wrong. Because Solomon had it all. He had more wisdom than Cornell could ever offer. He had more knowledge than anyone of his times, and yet he had no control over his own life, and he did not change the world. The world keeps going. Solomon is dead. Solomon's kingdom is gone, yet the world keeps going. His education gave him nothing. No dent in the world around him. The only thing it did was this. It showed him that as wisdom increases, lack of wisdom increases. What I mean by this is that as we grow in wisdom, we will understand that our wisdom never compares, is never the same as God's wisdom. It is never at that par. And as we grow in wisdom, we see how fallen the world is, and how little we know, and how little we understand. This is why he says here, and I set my mind to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly, because as wisdom increased, his understanding of evil increased, his understanding of a fallen world, his understanding of the sin of the world, his understanding of the striving after wind, that you have no control. And this line at the end is just so crushing, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. It is a paradox, yet it is true. As wisdom increases, lack of wisdom increases. When I look at the book of Ecclesiastes, I do not see a book of philosophy. Some people consider Ecclesiastes to be a book of philosophy, but I do not think it is one. Because Solomon had much philosophical knowledge, much wisdom, and yet he does not write about those things. Or maybe he did, but those things are lost. Rather, the things he speaks about in Ecclesiastes is the truth that philosophy doesn't work. To the atheists, they try to grasp to philosophy, education, knowledge, trying to understand, trying to prove that evolution is true, trying to prove that there is meaning by enhancing knowledge, by enhancing wisdom, by having these ideas of so many things, trying to make meaning in a fallen world. But Solomon says here, I've tried them all. I've studied existentialism, I've studied positive nihilism, and you know what? It didn't work. Because at one point or other I realized I was striving after wind, and that what I was doing was vanity of vanity. And that all of my wisdom, all of my knowledge, all of my philosophy, all of my education was pointless. And so I give you Ecclesiastes, a book written by the wisest man to ever live, influenced and inspired by God who is all-wise, and it is not a book of philosophy. Because it does not try to say that there is meaning in this world, and this is how you can find it. No. It says there is no purpose in earthly things. No wisdom, no knowledge, no education, no philosophy will fix your problems. This is not a book of philosophy. It is a statement that philosophy fails every single time. And so if you are someone who enjoys philosophy or enjoys thinking on these things, I hope you look at Ecclesiastes from the standpoint of verses 16 through 18, seeing that Solomon was a philosopher, yet he does not write a book of philosophy. Rather, he states that philosophy fails every time. Stop clinging to your philosophy, because really all philosophy is another distraction, trying to distract from the reality that all will die. And so this brings us to this question of, is ignorance bliss? Should Solomon just have had no wisdom? Should he have just left himself to know nothing? Is ignorance bliss? And I'm not going to answer that question at this point, but I want that answer to be raised, that question to be raised. Is ignorance bliss? Jumping into chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, we see the futility or the vanity of pleasure and possessions. The vanity of pleasure and possessions, and all of this depicted in this idea of folly. I'm going to read the text again. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself, and behold, it too was futility or vanity. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate with my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. He himself says that it is folly. And when I say folly, once again, I have this exact opposite of wisdom in mind. I mean, if you think of Proverbs speaks of this, that wisdom is on one side and folly is on the other. This folly of living for pleasure, living for self, enjoying all the things of life. And as we read this, we see that Solomon did this. He had vineyards and gardens and slaves and women and gold and silver and flocks and herds and wine and so much more. He had it all. Yet he says again, it is vanity, all is vanity. What I love about this text is where it says here, while my mind was guiding me wisely. This is a strange text to put in the middle of all of this vain living, and what I think it means is this idea that Solomon was still wise as he did this all, but he put it off for half a moment to enjoy living unwisely. And as he did this, he had a notepad in hand, like a journalist studying the ways of life, like a reporter trying to understand life. He was trying to understand how to make himself happy. Yet all the time he struggled to understand why none of it made him happy, because he's still wise and he understood that nothing gave him joy, nothing gave him pleasure. The gardens and the parks and the fruit trees and the ponds of water and the male and female slaves and the flocks and the herds, nothing gave him lasting joy. It just all faded away. It all went away and he lost it after a time. It's all gone. Like wisdom, pleasure does not give you control over your own life. It does not give you the capability to change the world. Pleasure does not do much. It does not make you happy. And now there is the argument, oh, but it makes me happy. I'm happy. Look deep in your heart, and I bet you're not happy. And if you are happy, you're living in ignorance. You are living in ignorance. And we will look in a moment how ignorance, I do not believe, is bliss. Ignorance is not bliss. But once again, it does beg that question, is ignorance bliss? Should I just go enjoy life? Should I just go dwell in the things of this world and ignore wisdom? Solomon tried to do this and it failed. You can't push it off. You can't run from the fact that the pleasures of this world fade away, and they do not change anything. They do not make you happy. All that in my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. He was pleased, for a moment. Thus I considered all my activities which my hand had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity, and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. And once again, the sun watches, this idea of time that goes on, watching and mocking, and saying, all of the things you did, all of the pleasure you had, all of the joys you had, they are not lasting, they are not true joy, and they burn away, and they are gone in a moment, and you cannot catch them. Happiness is like the wind. It goes and it goes and it goes, and no matter how hard you strive after it, you cannot catch the wind. You cannot bridle the wind. You cannot control the wind. You cannot herd the wind. Gets away every single time. Happiness does not give you control over your own life, and it does not allow you to change the world. And I think it's important to address that we have more comforts and more joys than Solomon could have ever imagined. We read some of these things and go, Solomon, that's nothing. I have air conditioning. I have a heater. I have an iPhone. I have a television. I have a car. Your chariots, they're nothing. I have things that are way greater. But if we look at the world today, it's clear. Happiness is still fleeting. Death still remains. We have more comforts than Solomon could ever imagine. Unlike his wisdom that we cannot ever have as much as that. We have things he could, even though he was a king, he never had. Yet we have them, and they too do not give us joy. Look at all of the great people of our age. Look deep at their lives. Look at their stories, and you will see this truth that Solomon gives us. Wisdom does not give us joy, and folly does not give you joy. Both are distractions from the struggle of finding meaning in a vain world. I listened to a sermon on this from Austin Duncan, and he said this, and I thought this was very powerful. Solomon is so relentless because we are so relentless in ignoring death. Solomon is so relentless in teaching this principle that life is vain and life is meaningless and you will die, because we are so relentless in ignoring death, especially in the U.S. How often we try to put death into the hospitals. We try to hide from it. We don't want to see that death is a reality. We want to ignore the fact that all of our wisdom and all of our folly amounts to nothing, and so we hide and we live in ignorance, but it doesn't work. And Solomon is so relentless because we are so relentless in ignoring death. Life is vanity and a striving after wind. Wisdom does not work, and folly doesn't work either. And so this leads us again to this dark state. And this leads us to this section that I will call the personal crisis revisited. The personal crisis revisited. Ecclesiastes 2:12 through 23. In this text we first read, "So I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly, for what will the man do who will come after the king, except what has already been done?" And what this is a reaffirmation of his credibility. Him saying that I have experienced all wisdom and all folly, and no one who comes after me will be able to do it as great as I did. But it also leads to this idea that this cyclical element of life, that life repeats and life goes on, and no one after him will be able to be any greater than he was, because life doesn't change and life repeats. And so it's this cynical view of life. It's giving himself credibility, but in a almost pessimistic tone, saying there's nothing you can do better than I did, because life never really gets better. It just repeats and it goes on. And then before I continue in this text, what is the personal crisis? If we look at verses 2 through 4 of chapter 1, we read it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. And then jumping to verse 11, there is no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. This is the personal crisis. I will die. I will be forgotten. I will die. I will be forgotten. Verses 12 through 17, or 13 through 17. And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in the head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both. And I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity, for there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. I will die. What I think is fascinating about this passage is it does say that wisdom is better than folly, and it does teach that no ignorance is not bliss, and that wisdom is good to have, because by wisdom we do not live in darkness. It teaches here that yes, you should live wisely. And Proverbs, another book written mostly by Solomon, is thick with this truth. It speaks of wisdom and folly over and over again. But I don't want to be stuck in the weeds. I don't want to be stuck in the weeds of morality. Because it's not about morality, it's about mortality. It's not about morality, it's about mortality. Because what does he say right following that? Both will die. Both, the fool and the wise man alike, are both under the curse of death, and both will die. No matter how wise you are, no matter how foolish you are, you will die. You cannot escape death. And so it causes him to ask, why have I been extremely wise? This is a harsh question to ask, but prefaced by what he said earlier, that wisdom is better. He is not saying here that he shouldn't have been wise. Rather, he's just saying how hard it is to be a wise man, and this reality that we think these things, and we live in this light, and we have this harsh reality that your wisdom is not good enough, your folly is not good enough. However, wisdom is better than folly. But it's not about morality, it's about mortality. If you want to talk about morality, let's go to Proverbs. But once again, morality can just become a distraction, and that's his point here. Don't focus on your wisdom. Don't focus on that it's better than folly, at least not right here. Rather, focus on this reality that no good, no evil, no wisdom, no foolishness, no righteousness, no wickedness can ever cheat death. You will die. And it leads Solomon to this state where he says, so I hated life. So I hated life. How can a Christian say this? How can one who believes in God, who gives the blessings and the goodness of life, say this? How often have you said this? How often have I said this? How often have I dwelt in this dark corner of the heart? Once again, context is incredibly important. He says, so I hated life, in context of this reality that wisdom and folly both lead to death. He's not saying that I hated life in the idea of salvation or the gifts of God that are given to him, and he's going to make that clear as we move into the future text. Rather, he's saying that if all life is a dwelling on the personal crisis that you will die, then why live at all? This is the struggle of the wise man. And it leads us again to this question of maybe ignorance is bliss. Maybe it's bliss, but I don't think it is. Because when you live in ignorance, you walk in darkness, and you walk in sin, and you walk in evil, and you don't realize how life is short. But when we live in light of wisdom and understanding that life is vain and a striving after wind, we are able to take life with a idea that it is short and not take it for granted. I will die, and I will be forgotten. Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor, for which I labored under the sun. For I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor, for which I have labored, by acting wisely under the sun. This, too, is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor, for which I labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and a great evil. For what does a man gain in all his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all the days of his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. All of Solomon's wisdom and all of Solomon's folly comes under this umbrella here of toil. Because he worked for his wisdom and he worked for his folly, because he was a king and he worked for these things. And he says of these things that all of his wisdom and all of his folly under the umbrella of toil would be robbed by the one after him, because he would die. And when he dies, everything will be taken from him. And what's even more brutal than that is he won't even know who it will be that will take it from him. He doesn't know if it will be a wise man. He doesn't know if it will be a fool. All he knows is that it will be someone who will take everything that he has from him, and that someone too will die. And so the cycle repeats of wise men and fools all living and then all dying. And the truth that even if you could leave a legacy, even if you could leave something behind, it's not really a legacy at all. Because your stuff and your soul are separate. Your stuff and your soul are separate. Your stuff stay here. Your soul goes up into eternity, either in heaven or hell. But your stuff stays here. You can leave your stuff behind as a legacy, but your soul, what you believe in, what you teach to the people after you, you can't really leave that behind. You don't believe me? Look at Solomon. He writes the book of Proverbs, especially the first 9 chapters, which I hope to look at over the summer. And he writes them mainly to the Rehoboam, saying to Rehoboam, here is how you ought to act. You ought to act wisely. Not to live in folly, but to act in a fear of God, to live for him, to do what is right, and to live in wisdom, and listen to the woman of wisdom, and that is the greatest rich of all. And what does Rehoboam do? He does such evil and such atrocity that the kingdom under him is split in half, and Jeroboam takes 10 of his tribes, and all Rehoboam is left with is Judah and Benjamin. Rehoboam does not act wisely, and he does not listen to the legacy of his father. Your legacy does not last. Your soul and your stuff are separate. So stop focusing on your stuff and focus on your soul. Stop focusing on your wisdom and your folly, whichever may be your fancy, but rather dwell on the fact that you will be forgotten. All of Solomon's wisdom and all of Solomon's folly were robbed from him. When you die, you take nothing with you. You leave none of yourself behind. And once again, this is true. Solomon was forgotten. How little of Solomon do we know? How little of the things that he did do we actually have? His kingdom is gone. His kingdom did not last forever. It's gone. He strove after wind, and the wind got away. How often do we do this? How often do we try to be remembered? How often do we try to strive after wind? But it gets away every single time. This is the personal crisis. I will die. I will be forgotten. And once again, like last week, we are now in a very dark state. We cannot escape it, because wisdom does not work, and folly does not work, and if these two things are things on opposite sides of the spectrum, then nothing in the middle will work. Nothing works. There's no point trying. There's no point fighting for meaning. I mean, just in a really dark place, again. But Solomon does not leave us here, and he gives us a perplexing answer. he gives us a perplexing answer. There is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I've seen, that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? For to a person who is good in his sight he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. What are you saying, Solomon? You just said that folly is pointless. You just said that wisdom is pointless. What are you saying? He's saying this. And it's so crazy that he's saying this, and it's so powerful at the same time. He's saying, strive for wisdom. Strive for knowledge. Strive for it. Live for it. Be wise. And he's also saying, enjoy life. Not folly, but rather that, yes, you should enjoy life. You should enjoy life like I did, just not to the extent that I did it. Not that it controls your life. But yes, you should enjoy life. And you should be wise. Ignorance is not bliss. You should be wise. Living without any enjoyment at all, that's not it either. You should enjoy life. Because God has given these things. Life is a gift from God. Connecting back to a theme that we looked at last week, life is not a gain. And if it was a gain, we'd lose every time. Life is a gift from God. And we dwell on Him and understand that He gives these things, that He is the giver of good things, that He is the giver of wisdom, that He is the giver of joy. Then man, we can enjoy life so much better. Who can have enjoyment without Him? No one. You can't have it without Him. You can have it for a moment, but it goes away. But when you have joy in something that lasts forever, something that combines both soul and stuff, something that is God, that when we live for Him and enjoy life, I'm not saying read the Bible. That's not what I mean when I say enjoy life. I mean go to Six Flags. I mean smile. I mean eat some ice cream. That's what Solomon is saying here, and it doesn't make sense. I feel like I would read this and his response would be, you should just live in solitude like a hermit and read your Bible every day and hope that God will not strike you down. But he doesn't say that. Rather, he says God is a gracious God. God is a gracious God to a point that He allows us to enjoy life. Even though life is fallen, even though we are sinful people, we are allowed to enjoy life. And we are allowed to have a glimpse of His wisdom. We are allowed to be smart and be educated and pursue knowledge and pursue wisdom. And all of this is a gift from God. And this is an incredibly powerful message. And it is a message that Solomon will repeat throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. This truth that yes, life is vain. And yes, joy is vain. Folly is vain, and wisdom is vain. Yet still, we should delve into these things when they're in a right perspective, understanding that they are from Him. But to the sinner, He has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This is very interesting. Because if you don't believe in God, and you don't live for God, then all of your wisdom and all of your folly are just that. You will die. You will be forgotten. And God will take everything that you have and He will give it to one who serves Him. That's exactly what it's saying here. And once again, it's not saying that the Christian life's going to be easy and God's going to orchestrate everything so that it's given to you. But it is saying that God lives for the people who believe in Him. He does not live for the people who do not believe in Him. So let us trust in Him, especially since if you believe in Him, you have a greater blessing than the sinner would ever have and could ever have, and that is Jesus Christ, the mediator between sinful man and God. Once again, this is not what he's focusing on here. Rather, he's focusing on the temporal pleasures of life, which are wisdom and pleasure. So let us enjoy life. Let us live wisely. Let us have a smile on our faces. Ecclesiastes should not make us sad because it's not a book of philosophy. It's not trying to find purpose in a meaningless world. Rather, it is understanding that there is purpose in a meaningful world, and that purpose comes through God. Let us enjoy life. Let us be wise. Purpose, pursue pleasure, and pursue wisdom in light of God. Understand that folly is fleeting and wisdom is fleeting, but when done rightly and done in light of God who gives good gifts, we may enjoy life. Every good and precious gift is from above. God gives these gifts so that they may be enjoyed. Do not live in nihilism. Do not live in existentialism, but live in a reality that God is a good God, a God who has given us so many good things. Let us be joyous. Let us live without complaining. Let us live happy. Let us read Ecclesiastes with a smile. Thank you, and I'll see you next week. Actually, before I leave, this is important. As I went through 1 Kings 1 through 11, I really enjoyed having an opportunity to preach the word, and I wanted to give that opportunity to some new faces. So I actually won't see you next week. A friend of mine will be on here, and he will introduce himself, and he will be going through Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And moving forward, I will be on here about every other week, and I'll be allowing some of my friends to jump on here as well. And the reason for that is because I want to give them the opportunity that was given to me. It's really been an awesome opportunity to use this platform to share the Word of God, to understand what preaching, in a sense, is all about, even though I am super unexperienced. So I'm going to throw on here some other people who are also very unexperienced, but who I believe are willing to delve into the text as well, and are able to teach some of the things of Ecclesiastes and learn from Solomon as well. So that's going to be a really awesome experience, and we'll be starting that next week. Thank you.